Alright guys, Murph's here, and today I want to talk about the 9mm cartridge in our standard cartridge discussion format. Now, for those of you who have perhaps been with the channel since the beginning, or at least seen some of my early videos, know that I've already done a video on the 9mm, primarily covering its history. This time around, I want to take that same video concept, however, I want to focus more on the data-driven setup that I do now for cartridges. That was way early in my making of videos. It was one of the first cartridge discussion videos that I did, and I've kind of refined my process in the past couple of years since then. So, for today's video, we're going to do a light amount of history, go into some of the cartridges, specifications and data and all that kind of stuff, convert that information into contextual data, and then do a little bit of cartridge comparison before everything is said and done. All right, so with that, why don't we go ahead and get into history. In the early 1900s, semi-automatic handguns were starting to really take form. A lot of militaries were looking to diversify into semi-automatic handguns, and finding handguns and cartridges to work in them, or developing handguns and cartridges to work in them, was this new endeavor. And for the most part, everyone was still trying to figure out what exactly semi-automatics were going to look like. And this is where you see a lot of interesting designs from Borchardt and Luger, as well as, wow, you know what? I don't want to dwell a lot on early 1900s handgun design. The important thing to cover here is that for the most part, cartridges being designed during this time period were relatively light in caliber. A lot of 32s, 380s, something in kind of that realm of power factor. No one at this time would have guessed that the 9mm would become one of the premier cartridges to stem from this time period. That and the 45 ACP, developed by John Moses Browning around the same time. Now, the 9mm would be first adopted by the German military in 1908 and would serve with them all throughout World War I. And would also become the basis for a lot of submachine gun designs going into World War II, where pretty much all of Europe was using some sort of 9mm submachine gun, or at least the vast majority thereof. Now, submachine guns and later on service-style pistols would become the go-to venue for the 9mm, with some early adoption by the FBI in the 1970s and in the 1980s, up until the 1986 Miami-Dade County shootout, where 9mm was found to have performed suboptimally in that conflict, which spurred the development of the 10mm, which we've discussed in the 10mm video. So if you're interested in that, I'll throw the link in the description. Now, after the 10mm was found to be overpowered, the 40 Smith and Wesson then was the next thing, the next hottest cartridge that had to be had. And now the trend has gone back to the 9mm, with the FBI recently adopting Glock handguns chambered in 9mm. This, since the FBI are trendsetters in law enforcement techniques as well as gear, has caused the vast majority of the law enforcement community to also trend back towards 9mm. This has given rise to a resurgence in the discussion about 9mm versus literally every other handgun out on the market. All right, guys, that was very much so a abbreviated version of the history of the 9mm Luger cartridge, which if you're interested in a more deep dive into 120 years of 9mm, you should check out the video. I'll put a link in the description. Now, let's go ahead and kind of describe this cartridge, do some science association while we're at it. So, on the left is the 380 ACP, in the middle is the 9mm, and to the right is the 45 ACP. Now, the 9mm cartridge is a round nose projectile, which can be FMJ, hollow point, FTPs, if you're looking at Hornady critical defense. There might even be some soft points out there, glaziers, safety slugs, a wide variety of projectiles, generally ranging in weights from 115 to 147 grain. However, you can get them as low as 50 grain, though 88 is probably more common than even the 50 grain, and as high as 150 grains. The cartridge casing is 19mm long and is rimless. Now, you'll hear this referred to interchangeably as the Luger and Parabellum. Either designation is correct. The Luger more or less stems from the original handgun that chambered the cartridge. Parabellum, I believe, was the German designation for it, which is, of course, Latin for war. Now, velocities with your weight ranges going from 115 to 147 grain, you can bet you that there's a little bit of a variance in speed, but generally you're looking at 1,000 to 1,300 feet per second. Now, if you go to the 150 grains, you're going to drop to sub 1,000 feet per second. If you go at the 50 grains, you get to close to 2,000 feet per second. So there's kind of your variance there in 9mm loadings. Now, let's go ahead and start converting this into contextual data, because there's a lot of things that need to be framed here. First off, it is the opinion on this channel that handguns and by extension handgun cartridges are suboptimal fight stoppers. Now, there's some things that you can change about the dynamic in which you're utilizing a handgun cartridge. Pairing it with a little bit longer barrel will give you greater performance. However, when we're talking about 9mm, you pretty much really lose any massive, or you don't really see a great velocity increase past 10 inches of barrel. So a lot of guys running around out there with like 16-inch PCCs, yes, they're lightweight, fantastic handling firearms for competition type purposes, but you're not getting that much more velocity. You're getting a slight increase, it's just not an actual beneficial increase in actual velocity. So, handguns, for the most part, terrible fight stoppers. There are a couple that stand out in this case. 357 SIG has some good fight stopping performance dynamics. 10mm, 357 Magnum, any of the Magnum loadings and on up. Now, of course, they come with their own detriments, which have been discussed in their individual videos, which if you're looking for more cartridge discussion stuff, I will throw some more links in the description. Because surprisingly, these videos actually, some of them at least, do quite well. Now, or relatively well for a small channel like mine. Now, with that idea framed, handguns are suboptimal fight stoppers to begin with. I really don't care to necessarily split hairs when it comes to velocity or energy of handgun cartridges, because bottom line up front, yet again, velocities are relatively low, and energy being derived from velocity and mass generally comes out to about the same when you're comparing between different handgun cartridges. Looking somewhere between like 325 and 400 foot-pounds of energy. Because, you know, that's going to be the same with a 230 grain 45 ACP moving at 850 feet per second, or very close to 850 feet per second. The energy is going to be very similar to a 115 grain 9mm moving at 1100 feet per second. They're not going to be one for one. I didn't actually do the math, but I've crunched the math previously in both the 40 Smith and Wesson and the original 9mm videos and found a lot of the same data. They were all very comparable. So this kind of messes with a lot of people's understanding of how ballistics in general work. They have a tendency to say, well, we need like super high velocities. So they like that 50 grain 9mm moving at almost 2,000 feet per second. Where other guys are like, well, I need heavier weights. So they want that 150 grain 9mm. They want that 230 grain 45 slug flying down range. And then you have other people who really highlight the energy side of things. Well, you know, the FBI indicated that this energy level is what you needed. However, the FBI did a lot more research than just talking about velocity or energy or any of those types of things. After the Miami-Dade County shootout, all of their research became consumed with the idea of testing handgun cartridges for efficacy. And they came up with a standardized testing protocol, which a lot of other people have taken and continued to expand on. And this was utilizing ballistic gelatin blocks and 4 layers of denim in order to try to clog up hollow points and test the efficacy of defensive loads out there on the market for handguns. Now, whenever it comes to choosing personal defense loads for my needs, I go to luckygunner.com. And that is because Lucky Gunner has been maintaining a thread of their website that has only been testing handgun loads, and they've been expanding it for the last 7 years. I've been on it for 7 years, and they have gone from just covering like 9mm 40, 45 and like 380 to they've got 22, they got 357 SIG, they've got a wide variety of options that are out there on the market and a wide variety of loads for each of them. They do 5-shot strings, and they show you the results of the expansion for those projectiles, as well as an average of the velocities and the penetration distances, because what the FBI has found is that penetration and expansion are the keys when it comes to handgun efficacy. So 1.5 times expansion, is what they're looking for in a maximum of 18 inches, minimum of 12 inches, which for duty use, they tend to prefer 18 inches. Now, something else to keep in mind here when it comes to ballistic gelatin. Ballistic gelatin is not a one-for-one comparison with the human body. It is a calibration of all of the different air, fluid, densities as well as bone and all that kind of stuff that you will find in the human body. Muscle, fat, all those types of things. So 18 inches in ballistic gelatin is not 18 inches in the human body. That's a common misconception whenever it is that we're talking about this, because people just think in terms of numbers, not the context that those numbers are utilized in, which is like a part of science or something. Now, when you look at Lucky Gunner's charts, this excellent gold mine of data, what you'll find is that there are a large supply, a ready on-hand supply of effective 9mm handgun cartridges that are getting 1.5 times expansion, consistent 1.5 times expansion on top of that, in addition to over 12 inches of penetration and under 18 inches of penetration. They are meeting FBI standards. And this is consistent with the FBI's findings because they have switched back to the 9mm based off of their own research. It is approved for carry yet again. And this is why so many law enforcement agencies have gone back to it as well. Now, that is not to say that you cannot find it in others, which kind of brings us to our comparison portion here. You will find so many people comparing other cartridges to 9mm because it is more or less an industry standard. We'll get into that more in the conclusion portion. Now, for today's comparison, I do want to go ahead and look at the 45 ACP, which for that, we're looking at somewhere between 185 and 230 grain projectiles, moving at roughly 800 to just under or right around 1,000 feet per second. Now, there are outliers in this as well. Somebody's going to hop into the comments section and talk about what Buffalo Bore or whatever manufacturer is producing. However, those are niche loads. They are not what you're going to find just sitting on the shelves, and they are not going to be accessible to the average person because they are also rather expensive. Underwood, same type of deal. You can get these like crazy high velocity or heavy projectile Underwood loads. However, I'm not going to walk down to my local gun shop and just find those sitting on a shelf. I'm going to have to order those special, and ordering ammunition, especially if it's not in like bulk, is rather expensive if you guys haven't done it recently. So we are looking at factory loads that can be readily resourced because that's a major portion of this. Now, I'm not necessarily going to go over the energy aspect of it as much as I am going to acknowledge that the 45 ACP, yet again, has a wide variety of loads out on the market that perform to FBI standard. It does. It's a fantastic cartridge. I enjoy shooting the 45 ACP. However, there's a couple things we have to take into context whenever it is that we're comparing 45 and 9mm, and that again comes down to context. 9mm is a lighter recoiling cartridge, so if I pair it with a lighter handgun, I have less perceived recoil than I would in a comparably weighted handgun with a 45 ACP cartridge. I also have greater capacity, which means that I can fit more rounds into the same package. That would carry fewer 45 ACP rounds. Now, a lot of people say, well, if you can't get it solved in one, then you need to get better at shooting. But, guys, I've been in high intensity situations where I was carrying larger cartridges than everyone else around me, and I was carrying fewer of them. And I was keenly aware of the fact that I had less ammo than everyone else around me. And I didn't like that. I didn't like that one bit. So, when times are tough, when the situation is tense, it becomes very reassuring to have a large number of rounds on hand, because that is the measure, that is the work that you are conducting at that point. That is how you are able to grade your survivability, is by the amount of ammunition you have on hand and the number of threats that are prevalent. Because just because you're dealing with one guy in front of you doesn't mean that there's not somebody else lurking off to the side, that person doesn't have some type of support, because we're talking about ambush predators. And if it's good enough to engage one target, I need it to be good enough to engage more than one in order to be able to have that level of security involved in what it is that I'm doing. It's kind of like a one is none type deal, but when we're talking about capacity, it's more like 7's none, but 14 is enough. Now, in addition to that, whenever you shrink the 45 ACP into that smaller, lighter, lower capacity option, it becomes a tad bit ungainly in order to be able to have faster follow-up shots and all that kind of stuff. Now, again, you should not shoot faster than what you're actually able to read your sights. Or as you can only shoot as fast as you can read your sights, is how shooting engagements should go off. However, the vast majority of people out there carrying don't train that often. They don't go to courses. They don't get corrected by somebody who's more experienced and knowledgeable than them. So when push comes to shove, they drop to lowest level trained and they dump the magazine. and they're not reading those sights properly. And this is, even with a 9mm handgun, you're running into a situation where you're potentially turning your justified shoot into a homicide investigation. However, it becomes worse with the larger cartridge that you carry. If you take, for example, an M&P Shield 45 and an M&P Shield 9 and put both of those on the clock, the M&P, same shooter who has a good proficiency level is going to shoot the 9mm faster and more accurately. Now, this is where your shot placement crowd comes in, which, yes, shot placement's important, but if we're talking about, the difference between headshots and center mass shots, like ultimately, I'm just concerned about getting holes into fight-stopping areas. So, yeah, if I shoot him in the knee, he might stop trying to fight me, but he's not necessarily out of the fight, whereas if I shoot him in the heart, he's definitely down. That's a whole separate video all by itself. The key thing here is that the 9mm will be faster on follow-up shots, faster on sight reacquisition, and faster to end the fight. And it has the same performance efficacy as the 45 ACP. This is why the 9mm is a go-to option for so many people. All right, so what are my recommendations when it comes to the 9mm cartridge? Would I recommend it for duty use? Absolutely. 100%. It has been serving in the holsters of a wide variety of militaries and law enforcement and different government agencies and all that kind of stuff. 9mm has put plenty of people on the ground. It is a fantastic duty option, especially when you consider the higher capacity for the same overall surface area. When you consider the light recoiling characteristic and still the same effect on target. It's a no-brainer at that point. What about self-defense type uses? Absolutely, it's a fantastic concealed carry cartridge in a smaller, lighter handgun like a SIG P365 or a Glock 43X or a Glock 43, or if for some reason you're carrying an XDS9 because you hate yourself, I guess. Whatever it is that you're carrying it in, it's probably a good performer. Now, of course, there's a trade-off there. You can get a handgun that is too small for the 9mm, but it is still going to perform better than a larger cartridge in the same size dynamic. And generally, you're not going to have a 45 that's going to be a comparable 45 that's going to be the same size. They're generally going to have larger frames, larger grips, all that kind of stuff. Because it's a fatter cartridge, it's going to take up more surface area. So it's not a one-for-one in this case. What about home defense? There are plenty of people out there, myself included, who are defending their homes with 9mm. The 9mm will perform just fine in that capacity. There is zero reason to hold anything against it. Now, could you run into an issue with over-penetration within your own home if you have kids or something like that? Absolutely. That's something you have to look into and take into account for your overall home defense plan, because it is important to have a plan instead of just wing it. Especially since, in theory, the advantage should favor you. It's your home. It's your home turf. You're the one who should be determining the factors for success. All right, what about hunting type use? Now, this is where you lose me. I would not consider the 9mm to be a great option for hunting, but I'm sure some people hunt probably small game like rabbits with it. I think it's a touch much because there's not really a lot of meat or size to a rabbit to begin with, and a 22 would perform just well, but you know what? You do you, boo. Honestly, there's not a lot I wouldn't recommend the 9mm for as long as you keep context in account. All right, guys, let's go ahead and wrap this up. The 9mm is the most popular handgun cartridge out on the market for a reason. Even in this time where ammunition is more expensive than it used to be, the 9mm is still pretty affordable in comparison to 45, 40 Smith and Wesson, 357 SIG, and all that kind of stuff. And as much as you can say that, like, oh, well, it's just money, what's your life worth and all that type of stuff, money's a factor. Money dictates how much time you can spend out on the range. Money dictates whether or not you can afford to go to a 1,000-round shooting course in order to become more proficient with your firearm. Money indicates, how many self-defense loads you have on hand for your handgun and how often you rotate out that ammunition. There's a lot of things that money play a part in. It is ridiculous to discount cost as a factor for making determinations for your self-defense choices and priorities. The higher capacity, the low recoiling aspect of the 9mm cartridge is really what keeps it so fantastic. And with that, there's one time I would say 9mm does not have an advantage over any other cartridge, and that is if you neuter its capacity. If you're in a state that does not allow you to have greater than 10 round magazines, the 9mm becomes less interesting to me at that point, because I'm stuck at 10 rounds no matter what. I might as well have a larger cartridge. At that point, the 9mm makes a lot, or not going with the 9mm makes a lot of sense. The 40 or the 45 ACP, specifically the 40 or the 357 SIG, make a lot more sense to me in those types of dynamics, because I am going to want something a little more potent for the capacity. But I still get the fantastic light recoiling aspect of the 9mm even at the lower capacity if that's what I want to go with. So there's that. Alright guys, that's pretty much what I got on this particular subject. I hope you found this interesting, and have a good day.